Hey friends, welcome back to Midweek as we continue through our series titled Own It. And what we're doing in this series is we're just learning what it looks like to take responsibility for where we are, who we are, and where we hope to go. And so we're going to be going back and forth between the Old Testament and the New Testament, just looking at different examples through people's lives, maybe through different narratives, to just see how they responded when accountability came into their life, whether they owned it and confessed on their own, or whether this was brought about them or judgment put on them by God. Things like that is what we're going to talk about. And so today we're going to be in Galatians. And now I really appreciate the book of Galatians. When Paul's writing this letter, he gives us at the beginning a very clear indication of how he came to be who he is. I mean, chapter 1 tells us that it was 3 years after the crucifixion that he goes to stay with Peter for a while. And the only other person that was there was James, the brother of Jesus, and how he sat there and he learned and he talked with them. And then chapter 2, it says, and 14 years later, he comes back and all of the apostles kind of just accept him as one of their own. And so it's really cool to see that as the book of Galatians opens up. And then he goes into this context of what it looks like to be separated from the law. And Paul's big on this, about how the law weighs us down. And so I just want to ask you this. How do you handle confrontation, especially when it's dealing with your sin? If someone was to come up to you and say, hey, like, I see that there's an issue that you're struggling with. How well do you handle that? Because my guess is if you don't handle that well, you probably struggle with a sin called pride. And pride is one of those things to where it really diminishes the concept of accountability, because we feel like we're better than, we're too good for, we're above that. And so we don't like to talk about our mistakes, but rather we'd rather point them out to everybody else. And so what I want to do tonight is I just want to read, and we're going to read a little bit of the Bible at the end of chapter 5, kind of going into chapter 6. And I just want you to hear the words that Paul is writing and just kind of see how this plays out in your life. So let's start with verse 16. He says, but I say, walk in the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. So this goes back to where Paul was saying that I do the things I don't want to do. I don't do the things I should be doing. But this is that context that he's playing out for us. He's saying that there's the Spirit of God who's living within you, talking to Christians, but there's always this fleshly appeal, right? The desires of the world that is constantly pulling you in. One of Satan's tactics, by the way, if you look at 1 John 2:16. And so he uses these desires to confuse you. And so every day you're living with guilt and shame because either you fall into temptation and you sin, or you overcome and you follow the Spirit and you feel joy. But very rarely do both of those feelings kind of mingle back and forth. You either have one or you have the other, and it's always every day a constant battle. And so he's recognizing that, and he's saying if you just follow the Spirit, these fleshly things, these worldly things, they really won't be as tempting for you if you walk in the Spirit. The problem is walking in the Spirit can sometimes be a bore, right? Because the things that we're attracted to is what makes those temptations for us. We desire it. We want that. And he says you have to pick one or the other. Let's just keep on reading verse 18. But if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident. And here he goes and he lists all these works of the flesh, these things that are worldly and that you desire. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now this is scary, right? When he says that, because I look at this list and there's a few things in there that I can say I'm struggling there. Right? There are some things in here where I look at that list and I'm like, I have fits of anger. There's times I've been jealous. There are moments where sexual immorality overwhelms me. I look at this list and I go, oh boy, I'm not doing well. And he says, like, if this is a habitual practice that you continue to just live into and you give into that desire, that is not what the kingdom of God is about. And he says this is going to be a struggle. But then he reverses it. Look at verse 22. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit. So he's giving you a contrast of what this looks like. You have the world that is trying to get your attention, the flesh that has its desires, and he's giving you attributes of what it looks like when you walk in the flesh. But then he turns it on its head and he says, these are the attributes, the characteristics of those who are walking in the Spirit. Verse 22, but the fruits of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. What he's saying is that if you practice these elements, if you can find a way to make these the habits of your life, you never have to worry about whether the law will ever condemn you, because it won't. The law is not made for these characteristics, right? The law is made for those who fall into the flesh, right? The Old Testament, I've heard this said before, and the New Testament backs this up, where it says that we look at the Old Testament just to show you how crooked you are, right? And that's why these battles keep coming in, because you're dealing with Jews who are struggling with whether or not they want to go all in on Jesus, or whether they want to go Jesus and the law, or whether the law is what gets you to heaven. And that's where they're struggling. And Paul is trying to give them a distinction. If you want to live under the law, then you will be judged by the law. But if you live under the Spirit, you're going to have these characteristics that become the fruit of how you live. And if you live according to the Spirit, you never have to worry about condemnation, because that doesn't apply to those who live under this. And so here's where the own it part comes into play. If you're living your life for Jesus, it becomes evident in your everyday walk, right? You start to learn patience and kindness. You're starting to be good to people, right? You start to send some respect. Like, these are the characteristics that flow from the heart of those who are following Jesus. Does that mean you're going to be perfect? No, not at all. We still live in a fallen world. Temptation is going to overcome you at times. But what Paul is saying is, if you start choosing the Spirit more than you choose the flesh, you will always find yourself producing these types of fruit. And that's the person I want to be, don't you? And maybe you need to take a deep look at your life. And maybe if you're really wanting to know, ask the people who are closest to you and say, if you were going to categorize the type of fruit that I produce in my life, what would you say? Would you say I'm more like the world, or I'm more like the Spirit? And maybe even give them these characteristics that Paul lists on both sides. Am I one of those who is constantly joking about sexual sin? Do you always see a beer in my hand? Do you see me constantly craving attention from people, or being jealous or envious of what other people have? Or are you seeing the characteristics that are laid out as the fruits of the Spirit? Am I patient? Am I kind? Am I good? Am I loving? Am I faithful? Am I gentle in my approach to people? And he goes on to then say, after he distinguishes between the two, he says, now as he goes into chapter 6, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you as a spiritual leader, or you who are spiritual, should restore him in the spirit of gentleness. But keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. So I love how he immediately distinguishes between what it looks like to live in the world and to live in the Spirit. And then he says, we got to start keeping an eye on everybody else, especially the ones who are maybe new to Christianity, the ones who are trying to fulfill different things. These are the types of people that are going to fall quicker. And if we love them well, we're going to treat them well, and we're going to be able to pull through this thing together, as long as we could call them out with gentleness and approach the conversation and hopefully pull them from their wickedness. But he says you need to look at yourself, because if you're living in this and you're struggling with the sin that you're trying to help someone else come out of, it's really counterproductive. And so he says we need to make sure that we are on the path of righteousness and that we have the fruits of the Spirit falling from us before we ever start calling out the sins in our brother. And so read the rest of chapter 6 on your own and really get that feeling of what it looks like to carry the burden of one another. And if we're going to start owning where we are in life, we have to start looking deep to see where we're following. Are we following the spirit of the world, or are we following the Spirit of God who lives within you? It's time that we own where we are. Have a great week, everyone.